In the industrial streets of Clayton in the West Riding of Yorkshire, life in the early 1900s moves with a kind of worn-out persistence as smoke drifts low over rows of tightly packed houses, and the rhythm of factories sets the tempo for everything else. Into this world is born Albert Pierrepoint, a boy who grows up not in comfort or certainty, but in a household shaped by instability, where money comes and goes without warning, and where silence often feels more reliable than speech. His father, Henry, is a man who cannot quite hold life still, working when he can, slipping away into drink when he cannot, and leaving behind a sense that nothing in the house is ever fully settled. And yet, underneath that ordinary struggle, there is something unusual that the boy only gradually begins to sense. A profession that is never spoken of directly, a role that exists in fragments of overheard conversations and carefully closed doors, as if it belongs to another world entirely. Henry Pierrepoint is, in fact, one of the state's official executioners, a man called upon to carry out hangings in prisons across Britain, but at home that reality is reduced to silence and avoidance, something too heavy or too dangerous to bring into daylight. Albert grows up around this absence of explanation, noticing more than he understands, the way adults stop talking when he enters a room, the way certain words never quite appear in full, the way his father's name carries a strange weight when mentioned by outsiders. At school, when the usual question is asked about what he would like to become, he does not hesitate in the way other children might. Instead, he writes that he wants to be an executioner, not as a dramatic ambition, but as something that already feels half inherited, like a path that exists before he has even chosen to walk it. There is no real understanding behind it at that age, only a child's attempt to make sense of a world where his father seems both ordinary and quietly set apart. A man who, in his mind, represents steadiness, precision and control. But childhood does not remain stable for long, and the family soon relocates to Failsworth near Oldham, where the industrial landscape shifts but the uncertainty remains, and where Henry's health declines while work becomes increasingly inconsistent. The boy leaves school early and enters the workforce, pulled into the machinery of mills and deliveries, where days are measured in labour rather than learning, and where adulthood arrives not with ceremony but with necessity. Then, in 1922, Henry Pierrepoint dies, and nothing about it is dramatic in the way stories often expect. There is no final speech or defining moment, only absence and a quiet reshaping of the household that follows. What remains, however, are two blue exercise books filled with his father's handwriting, recording in careful detail a hidden professional life that Albert has only ever sensed from the outside. Dates, names, notes, and the procedural record of execution carried out across years. When he opens them, he is not confronted with horror or shock in the way one might expect, but with structure, repetition and system. A world that is ordered rather than chaotic, even in its finality. And as he reads, something begins to settle in him that he cannot yet name. Not a decision and not a rejection, but a quiet awareness that this path, however strange, however heavy, is already waiting somewhere ahead of him. By the time adulthood begins to settle in, Albert Pierrepoint is no longer a boy looking in from the edges of a strange family history, but a working man moving through the practical realities of early 20th century Britain, where jobs are measured in reliability rather than aspiration, and where discipline often matters more than ambition. He works first in the mills and then in delivery work, becoming a drayman for a wholesale grocer, and later a driver and manager, learning how to handle responsibility in a world that values punctuality, precision, and quiet competence over anything else. And it is precisely those qualities, steadiness, control, and ability to remain composed under pressure, that begin to define him long before he ever formally enters the profession that once existed only in the background of his childhood. In 1931, he applies to become an assistant executioner, not out of impulse, but with a sense of inevitability that has been forming slowly over years, shaped by memory, curiosity, and the inherited shadow of his father's work. After initial rejection, he is eventually accepted and brought into a system that is at once bureaucratic and deeply secretive, a world where everything is governed by procedure but surrounded by silence. He is trained at Pentonville Prison, where practice sessions replace imagination with mechanics, and where the act of execution is broken down into steps, measurements, and timing rather than emotion or spectacle. There is a dummy used for rehearsal, ropes are tested and adjusted, and every detail is treated with the seriousness of engineering, as though the goal is not destruction but precision, a final act that must be carried out without error. It is here that the psychological shift begins to take hold, not in dramatic revelation, but in quiet repetition, as he learns that this role demands not intensity, but restraint, not emotion, but control. When his first real commission arrives in December 1932, he does not stand alone. He works alongside his uncle Thomas and travels to Dublin for the execution of a prisoner in Mountjoy Prison, where the entire process unfolds with an almost unsettling efficiency, compressed into minutes and governed by exact procedure. From the moment he enters the cell to the moment the trapdoor is released, everything is structured, measured and rehearsed, and there is no space for improvisation or hesitation. What he learns in that first experience is not the act itself, but the discipline behind it, that the role depends entirely on removing uncertainty from a moment where everything else is final. In the years that follow, he continues working as an assistant while maintaining his civilian life, moving between ordinary employment and the hidden world of executions, each reinforcing the other in unexpected ways. From his uncle, he learns the importance of composure, of carrying oneself without spectacle, and of treating the work not as performance, but as responsibility, where dignity is maintained not through emotion, but through control. And slowly, without announcement or drama, he begins to understand that the profession is not about power or violence in the way outsiders might imagine, but about procedure, a system designed to end life with as little chaos as possible. Yet even within that structure, something internal begins to form, a separation between the man who lives in ordinary daylight and the man who steps into rooms where final decisions have already been made. At this stage, he does not question the system itself. He simply learns how to operate within it, and in doing so he becomes increasingly defined by it. By the time Europe collapses into the final chaos of the Second World War, Albert Pierrepoint is no longer an assistant learning the craft, but a lead executioner operating at the centre of a system that has expanded far beyond Britain's domestic prisons and into the broken aftermath of a continent trying to reckon with itself. The work changes in scale, but not in method. The procedure remains precise, controlled, stripped of improvisation, but the meaning of it begins to shift in ways that are harder to ignore. Now the men who stand before him are no longer petty criminals or isolated murderers, but figures tied directly to war, occupation and mass violence, their crimes stretching beyond individual acts into systems of destruction that have reshaped Europe itself. And yet even here, the process does not change. The rope, the measurements, the timing, all remain intact, as if structure is the only thing holding the world together in the aftermath of collapse. After the war ends, Pierrepoint is sent to Germany, to Hamelin Prison, where the British authorities are tasked with carrying out sentences on convicted Nazi war criminals following the Bergen-Belsen trials. The atmosphere is different the moment he arrives, Not theatrical, not dramatic, but heavy in a way that feels almost architectural, as though the building itself has absorbed too much history and refuses to release it. Among those sentenced is Joseph Kramer, former commandant of Bergen-Belsen, a man associated with one of the most infamous concentration camps liberated at the end of the war. Kramer does not arrive as a myth or symbol, but as a physical presence inside a prison cell, contained, quiet, waiting in a system that has already completed its judgment. The executions at Hamelin are carried out in a controlled sequence, one after another, in rooms designed not for spectacle, but for efficiency. Pierrepoint works with military precision, moving through the list of condemned men with the same procedural discipline he has always used, though the scale now feels different, not in execution, but in consequence. When Kramer is brought forward, there is no exchange that lingers, no confrontation that defines the moment in dramatic terms. There is only the structure of the process itself, the walk, the positioning, the calculated drop. Everything is reduced to procedure. The execution takes only moments, but those moments sit inside a much larger silence, the silence of a continent trying to process what has already happened, and the silence of a man whose job is to make endings consistent, even when the world around him is anything but. Afterwards, there is no reflection allowed in the moment itself, only continuation. The next name, the next walk, the next carefully measured adjustment of rope and weight, and yet something begins to accumulate. Not emotion in a simple sense, but distance. A growing awareness that the work is no longer just about individuals standing before him, but about the scale of history pressing down through every room he enters. In Hamelin, the system is efficient, almost unsettlingly so. Executions are carried out in pairs or sequences, sometimes many in a single day, and Pierrepoint moves through them with the same disciplined calm that has always defined his approach. But now the repetition feels different, less like procedure, more like gravity. He leaves Germany, as he always leaves these places, quietly, without ceremony, returning to a life that still expects him to step behind a bar, serve drinks, and exist as if nothing else follows him home. But something has changed in the structure of how he sees the job, not in what he does, but in what it sits inside. A world where justice, history, and machinery briefly overlap, and where a single man is responsible for making sure none of it falters at the final second. By the time the war is over, and the machinery of post-war justice begins to slow into routine, Albert Pierrepoint is living a life that splits cleanly in two, though never comfortably, as if he is constantly walking a line between two versions of himself that are never allowed to meet. In one world, he is a state executioner, moving through prisons and carrying out sentences handed down by courts in Britain and across Europe, his work defined by precision, silence, and an almost bureaucratic discipline that leaves no space for emotion to interrupt the process. In the other world, he runs a pub, a place filled with noise, laughter, clinking glasses, and the ordinary chaos of everyday life, where people argue about football, complain about the weather, and talk about money as if it is the most important problem in existence. And in this second world, he is simply the landlord, polite, steady, unremarkable. No one who sits at his bar truly sees the other version of him, or at least, not fully. There is a strange discipline in how completely he separates the two lives. When he leaves a prison, he does not carry it visibly into the pub. There is no dramatic shift, no outward sign that anything extraordinary has taken place. He returns to pulling pints, wiping counters, listening to stories that feel small in comparison to the ones he has just stepped away from. But internally, the separation is not as clean, because repetition does something subtle over time. It does not shock, it accumulates. Each execution, no matter how procedural, adds to a private weight that has nowhere to go, because the structure of the job does not allow reflection in the moment, and the structure of his public life does not allow explanation afterwards. So it remains inside him, unspoken and unshared. There are nights in the pub where he stands behind the bar, watching people laugh too easily, argue too loudly, or worry about things that feel distant and temporary, and he becomes aware of a widening gap between what most people experience as the seriousness of life and what he has come to understand as its finality. To them, problems are solvable. To him, they are often irreversible, and that difference begins to create a quiet distance that he cannot close. Not isolation in the dramatic sense, but separation. A sense that he is present, but never entirely inside the same reality as everyone else. The job itself remains unchanged in structure, but its repetition begins to reshape how he thinks about it when he is no longer performing it. Names blur together over time, places merge. The process stays precise, but memory becomes less individual and more cumulative, as if he is no longer remembering specific people so much as recalling variations of the same final sequence. And that is where the tension begins to form, not in the act itself, but in what the act does to everything surrounding it. At times, there are moments of brief intrusion, not dramatic revelations, but quiet interruptions. A conversation at the bar that suddenly feels too ordinary, a joke that lands differently than it should, a silence that stretches longer than expected. But the real strain is not visible. It builds slowly, under routine, under discipline, under the calm exterior he presents to both worlds. Because the system depends on him not breaking the rhythm, and he depends on the system continuing to make sense, until gradually that balance begins to feel less stable than it once did. Not collapsing, just shifting, almost imperceptibly. And in that space between repetition and reflection, something begins to form that has no clear shape yet, only pressure. By the mid-1950s, Albert Pierrepoint is no longer moving through the system as a new presence or even as a central necessity, but as its most experienced operator, a man who has carried out hundreds of executions with a consistency that has made him both relied upon and, in a strange way, invisible within the machinery of the state. The routine is familiar now in a way that no longer feels like mastery so much as repetition. The calculations, the prison corridors, the brief walk from cell to execution chamber, all of it has become procedural memory rather than conscious effort. But something else has changed too. The world outside the prison system is beginning to change its relationship with capital punishment itself. Cases like Timothy Evans and Derek Bentley begin to circulate in public discussion, not just as legal matters, but as moral questions that refuse to stay contained within courtrooms. Doubt starts to enter the system, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. And for the man who has spent his life making the system work efficiently, doubt is not something he can ignore in others without eventually encountering it in himself. In early 1956, a final break arrives not through ideology or public debate, but through something far smaller and more procedural, a dispute over payment after a reprieve. A prisoner is spared at the last moment and the execution does not happen. The system, however, still treats the situation as administrative ambiguity, whether the fee is owed, whether the work counts, whether the act has been performed in a technical sense. It is not dramatic, but it is enough, because it exposes something that has been quietly building for years, the reduction of something irreversible into paperwork. And that, more than anything else, unsettles him. Soon after, he submits his resignation. No announcement, no public statement, no final performance. Just an end to the listing of his name on the official register. The system adjusts quickly, as systems do. Other men take over. The machinery continues without pause. And yet something in the shape of it has changed, because the most experienced hand in its operation has simply stepped away. After leaving the role, he does not disappear from life. He continues running his pub, moving through ordinary days that now feel almost unfamiliar in their simplicity. Conversations about weather and sport and customers and bills replace the structured finality of prison routines. But there is no dramatic reinvention of identity, no public transformation, just a man living inside the quieter half of his existence for the first time without interruption. Years later he writes his memoirs, and in them something long unspoken finally takes shape. Not confession, not regret in a theatrical sense, but reflection. He writes that he does not believe capital punishment deters murder, that after facing so many people at the end of their lives, he has seen no evidence that the system prevents what it claims to prevent. He describes those final walks not as spectacle or punishment, but as moments of human steadiness under an unbearable final certainty. And in doing so, he removes any remaining illusion that the job was ever about drama. It was always procedure, always control, always ending. In his later years, he speaks more cautiously, sometimes even uncertainly, as if distance from the work has also softened his conclusions about it. He does not claim certainty anymore, only experience. When he dies in 1992, it is not marked by any particular public moment of drama or national reckoning. There is no spectacle attached to it, no final summary that fully contains what his life represented. Instead, there is simply the quiet closing of a long life lived in two parallel worlds, one public, one hidden, both defined by structure, discipline, and restraint. And perhaps that is what remains most difficult to categorize about him. Not the number of lives he ended, but the fact that he lived so much of his own life in the space between certainty and doubt, carrying out a role that required precision, while slowly arriving at conclusions that questioned whether precision was ever enough.